Good day, everyone. Welcome to another episode of our research series program. I'm your host, Muhammad Rian Sanjaya, and today we have a distinguished guest joining us, Dr. Elisabeth Krammer from the University of New South Wales. Here we're going to discuss on tobacco policy in Indonesia, which is also part of our event on Mubiarto Public Policy Forum 2023. Now, before we start our conversation, I will briefly introduce Dr. Krammer. She is a senior lecturer in the School of Social Science at the University of New South Wales, Scientia Fellow, and an Art Decra Fellow in 2023. Dr. Krammer began her academic career researching corruption and anti-corruption in Indonesian elections, but her research interests have since broadened, sitting at the scholarly intersection between politics, policy, and interest-based advocacy with a focus on Indonesia. She has been awarded research grants from the Australian Research Council and the Department of Education and Training Endeavour program to support her research. Dr. Krammer's first monograph, The Candidate's Dilemma, Anti-Corruptionism and Money Politics in Indonesian Elections, published by the Cornell University Press, was published last year in 2022. And this book delves into the lived experiences of candidates to offer a nuanced study of how the political and personal intersect when it comes to money politics, anti-corruptionism, and electoral campaigning in Indonesia. Prior to commencing her academic career, Dr. Krammer also worked in a variety of industries, including the public service, international development, NGOs, and ESL teaching. And she was previously the Deputy Director at the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre, the SSEAC, at the University of Sydney before moving into her current role. She remains an honorary associate at the School of Language and Culture at the University of Sydney. In this opportunity, we're going to discuss on tobacco policy in Indonesia, and without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Elisabeth Krammer. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Krammer.
Thank you for having me.
How are you today?
I'm fine, thank you. It's been a long day, but I'm happy to be here.
Thank you, and we're really happy to have you here as well, both for the interview, also for the Mubiarto Public Policy Forum. It's going to be a relaxed interview and podcast, so no need to be really stiff or
okay. I'll try and loosen up.
Right, let's start the interview or the podcast with a question. What do you think about consumption of tobacco in Indonesia? Is it getting better? Probably not, but is it getting worse, or what happened with it?
Okay, that's a really good basic question to start with, and the truthful answer is I'm probably not in a position to answer it directly from my own research, but there are a number of institutions that have done studies to look at the smoking prevalence, particularly related to gender and age. And the various studies that we've seen over the last couple of years reflect that tobacco consumption is pretty stagnant in terms of its prevalence. It's not going up significantly, but it's also not decreasing significantly, which might sound okay in some circumstances or some scenarios, but for this particular issue, Indonesia's trajectory when it comes to smoking prevalence is really quite different to most other countries around the world where we have seen a decline. So Indonesia, regardless of whether it's going up significantly or staying the same, is actually still an outlier in terms of global statistics related to smoking prevalence.
Yeah, so comparatively to other countries in the world, we are basically getting worse. Comparatively.
Yeah. If your definition of getting worse is staying the same, then yes, I would say that's probably fair.
Right, thank you. The other question that came up to our mind is that what do you think about the tobacco excise, like cukai tembakau? Do you think it's still like the best policy to reduce tobacco consumption in Indonesia, or do you have any other opinion on fighting this consumption of tobacco?
Again, studies from around the world have shown that price as part of the decision-making matrix when it comes to deciding if you're going to smoke or not is a really significant factor, and that having cigarettes be more expensive, whether that's through tax or excise or price fixing, is going to change the behaviour of some smokers, and it's also going to increase the entry barrier for younger smokers who may be interested in taking it up, or they see it, their friends doing it, or people in their family doing it. If the product is really expensive, it's going to be difficult, well, at least more difficult for them to start smoking in the beginning. But I think it's just one part of the puzzle, right? So when we talk about tobacco control policy, the pricing and tax and excise is a key part of that, but there are many other parts that we also need to consider and that need to be factored into the policy regime. So you have tobacco advertising, and there are existing regulations in Indonesia about tobacco advertising, but even the ones that exist are not strictly enforced. So for example, things like regulations about advertising tobacco products in educational zones or near schools. That regulation does exist. Is it implemented? Is it enforced? That's a different question. So I think advertising is a key thing. I think also any kind of regulation that that provides instructions about, restrictions around what kinds of events cigarette companies can sponsor, and what kind of CSR activities they can be involved in is also really important, because what we don't want to see is tobacco companies leveraging their CSR funding and programs to portray the product as being positive or not so harmful, or giving people the idea that this particular industry isn't causing harm and it's actually causing good. So I think the government really needs to look at it holistically in order for the tobacco control program to be successful.
Yeah, so we need to have not to just focusing on one particular policy, but we need to be like more comprehensive in controlling this particular issue. Yeah, I agree. Now, the next question maybe is something that I'm not sure if you have heard about this before, but some local governments in Indonesia, they suggest that they are not willing to subsidize the national health insurance, the BPJS Kesehatan, if the individual is smoker. Like one quick read that I do yesterday was that the government in Gorontalo, they tell that they are not going to put the smokers in the recipient of this BPJS Kesehatan. And what do you think about it? Is it like a good thing to do?
Yeah, I mean, this again isn't part of my research focus, but I have an ideological view on this, if I can share that. I think if a country institutes a universal healthcare system, it should be universal. Everybody should have access to it, regardless of what their history is, regardless of what they've done in the past, for two reasons. Firstly, when we talk about not giving individuals access to healthcare, that presumes that the situation of that individual doesn't affect anybody else. So in denying healthcare to one person, you're actually not just affecting that one person, you're affecting their family, you're affecting their community, you're affecting people around them. So I think it's quite a narrow and very individualistic view of how citizens and people operate in their day-to-day lives to deny somebody access to healthcare on the basis of them being a smoker. Secondly, I think it's a really slippery slope if you start denying healthcare to some people on the basis of past actions. Then where are you going to, what's to stop you from extending that to other types of behavior? And I think, morally speaking, I find that very difficult. I think if the government has committed to a system where it's universal, and by being an Indonesian citizen you have the right to access this particular service, and it should be available to everybody regardless of whether they've been a smoker in the past or not.
Yeah, I agree with the slippery slope argument. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, it's just it's so hard to stop once you start doing that.
Yeah, I agree. The next question is on e-cigarettes. Yeah, I'm not a smoker. I never use e-cigarettes. I don't really know what's the difference between e-cigarettes with normal cigarettes. But Some people will say that it's kind of solutions to the tobacco problem. Do you think that's really a solution, or it's just, it's creating another issue?
I think that the idea that e-cigarettes could act as what they call a smoking cessation tool is something that's really been promoted by the industry of e-cigarettes. I think the evidence for whether it works or not is quite mixed. You will find academics and medical practitioners who think, yes, this is a good tool to help people as they, wean off traditional cigarettes, because, there are all kinds of things with e-cigarettes where you can have one or two puffs of the cigarette and then put it away, whereas if you have a traditional cigarette, usually, particularly if you're an addicted smoker, you will finish the cigarette to the very end. And then when e-cigarettes first came out as a product, there was promotion around them being less harmful than traditional cigarettes. I think that the evidence for that, again, we just don't know because they're such a new product and we haven't had the longitudinal studies on e-cigarettes that have been available for traditional cigarettes. Personally speaking, I think putting any kind of foreign chemical into your body unnecessarily is probably not going to be a good idea. But yeah, I think the Australian government has sort of taken a really interesting tactic with this in terms of e-cigarettes and vaping liquid that contains nicotine. So not all vapes contain nicotine, which is a whole other issue. Yeah. But in Australia, this is a legal product, but you have to have a doctor's prescription in order to access it. So you need to go to your doctor and say, I'm a smoker, but I want to quit. And then your doctor may give you a prescription for liquid nicotine for vaping as part of your smoking cessation toolkit, but it's definitely not the only thing. They also suggest counselling, they also suggest other strategies. So yeah, I think it's really hard to know right now whether e-cigarettes are helpful in terms of, the general experience of people who are quitting. But it's hard. I feel like it's hard to imagine that it would be as effective as maybe other strategies that sort of go deeper into the social and psychological motivations that are attached to smoking and addiction.
Yeah, it's still a new thing, new consumption goods, and we also don't really know what's going to happen next with that. Is it going to be like a gateway to using tobacco? It can be like the other way around.
I'm not sure actually what the situation in Indonesia is, but in Australia, vaping as an activity has been becoming more and more popular amongst teenagers and high school students, which is actually the opposite of using it as a cessation tool, right? They're using it as a hook to get people into the activity of smoking, and then maybe as a gateway to other products like traditional cigarettes or e-cigarettes, because a lot of the big multinational corporations that are involved in traditional cigarette production are also moving into e-cigarettes, or they have an e-cigarette brand. So I think, and vaping is actually, I think in a lot of ways probably more appealing than smoking was. I know, at least just from a practical level, it doesn't smell as much. So if you want to hide it from your parents, it's easier. You have all of these fancy flavors that you can buy. So I think, it seems to me that there is a big focus on trying to hook or appeal to the younger generation, which is kind of the opposite of what the industry has been telling us about e-cigarettes for a long time.
Or maybe they know, but they don't tell us.
Yes. I think there's a difference between what they say publicly and what happens behind closed doors. Yeah,
I'm sure that. Anyway, this probably is going to be my last question to you. Given that it is, we know that it's harmful, smoking, tobacco, and things. it's harmful for our health. But on the other hand, as we heard before, that a lot of millions of people probably is going to be affected by a policy that tries to control tobacco. So what do you think is like the ideal policy for tobacco control in Indonesia that tries to balance these two things?
I think, I mean, the FCTC actually does have quite a comprehensive framework when it comes to holistic tobacco control, but I think in Indonesia specifically, where the domesticity of the industry is so much a factor in the ability or the political will of the government to legislate or regulate it, it becomes really about finding policy pathways to give people more choice. So I think what I mean by that is, for example, okay, if you implement policies that are eventually down the line going to reduce tobacco sales and shrink the industry, then there needs to be complementary policies that give people within the industry the opportunity to retrain, to move to other sectors, basically to have the choice, whether that's, you know, early on where they get given retraining opportunities or other kinds of incentives for moving to different sectors, or whether it's at the end when there are no jobs left or very few jobs left and people are being laid off. I think there needs to be policies in place to kind of deal with those different scenarios. And once the government can come up with something that's palatable, that makes sense, that they can sell to the population as the solution, as part of the solution, I think tobacco control will become more of a, holistic tobacco control will become more of a possibility in Indonesia. I think too, it was interesting because in the session that we just had, there was a question on Zoom asking, you know, why are we trying to tell farmers what to do? Shouldn't they be able to make their own decisions? Shouldn't they, you know, aren't they the people who are best placed to make decisions about what they want to grow? And I think that's completely true, but this is about expanding their agency. So, you know, if you have a scenario where tobacco is absolutely the most profitable plant that a farmer can possibly grow, then of course it makes sense for them to grow that. But you know, even research that was just presented in the forum today shows that no, it's cyclical. Not every year is going to be profitable. There are lots of costs involved with at the beginning of the season in order to, you know, buy all of the things that you need for your crops to be successful. So the policies need to be a way for farmers to look at that as, okay, that tobacco farming is one option, but the government is giving me support to choose other options that might be equally viable or even more profitable for me. So yeah, I mean, I think sometimes some of the discourse and arguments around tobacco control can sound very paternalistic. Like, you know, we want to tell people what to do. Like, you shouldn't smoke and you shouldn't grow tobacco and you shouldn't do this and you shouldn't do that. But I don't actually think it's about that at all. I think it's about giving people options and supporting them in their choice if they want to move away to a different industry. And you have to remember too that tobacco farming and people who've been involved in that industry for generations are also culturally and emotionally tied to tobacco. So the incentives and the opportunities presented by alternatives need to be pretty compelling in order for them to change. You know, all of a sudden, you know, you have a family that's been growing tobacco for 100 years and then are they just going to stop next year? Maybe not, but the more the options are available and the more that the government is supporting that choice, I think that's where the ideal balance lies between creating policies that stop demand, but also addressing the concerns of people who are, you know, potentially going to lose their jobs as a result of that, or you know, farmers who may feel like their crops are going to be worthless because people don't want to buy rights anymore. And I think fundamentally we need to remember that the
Mm-hmm.
people who ultimately benefit from this industry are already rich.
Yeah.
They already have a lot of money. I think financially they will be okay if
We don't need to help them. Yeah.
no, I mean they've already got a lot of money. So
Yeah.
why are we thinking about them when we're making policies when there are other people who clearly need more support and more attention? So I think in terms of protecting the industry, we just need to remember, who are the main beneficiaries here. And yeah, of course, there are farmers and workers in cigarette factories who have a livelihood from this, but they're not making millions of dollars from the tobacco industry. So I think that's where the government needs to focus its attention.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Krammer, for the insightful, and I think it's a very important topic. Yeah, in Indonesia, it's been decades we have discussed about this, and hopefully there will be some breakthrough in the next few years on in this tobacco policy in the country. So again, thank you everyone for watching the podcast, and we'll see you in the next episode. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.